Hi everyone. This is going to be a really quick video just because I'm taking up homework from your last lesson, which was questions numbers 1 to 3 on page 240. And they're all pretty straightforward questions that I can answer probably in no more than about 3-4 minutes total. First question asks you, describe the three options that exist in establishing a government budget. Really, practically speaking, there are two. And then the third is theoretically possible, but will never happen in practice for obvious reasons. Your first option when you're setting a budget is to have a surplus budget. Surplus budget is reflective of having more revenue coming in for your government than you have money going out in the form of services and other government spending commitments. It happens. Sometimes when you have a boom in your economy, your government may choose to run a surplus and build up some money that it can then devote towards either debt repayment or maybe just building up sort of an emergency fund. And sometimes it can be actually a pretty smart move. Typically speaking, when government has black in terms of its budgets, it's not always common that you'll have a huge surplus because there's a natural tendency on the part of people in the public and people within the government to say, hey, we've got leftover money. Look at all these people who want money. There tends to be a little bit more money going out when there's more money that's there. And so typically speaking, you're likely going to see light surpluses for most governments, but not really, really large ones. If they're really, really large, there's often a sense that the government's being stingy and denying people money that it clearly has. I don't know if that's a good thing, but that is the general sort of philosophy that the government often is contending with. The second option, of course, is a deficit. If you have a deficit, then you have more money going out in terms of spending than you have coming in through means of revenue generation, primarily taxes, but other ways that the government makes money. That obviously is a common thing. It's probably far more common than the surplus situation. Especially in times when you have need, but also sometimes it's just a product of accumulation of spending commitments over time. It may be very hard to pull out of those red holes. We call that red, being in the red, when obviously you have more money paying out than you actually have coming in terms of your revenue. The third budget, in theory, is just a balanced budget. I don't know if there's ever been a government in the history of modern civilization that's had zero net sort of surplus or deficit. But when you get close to zero, sometimes we call that a balanced budget. And essentially what that means is that, yeah, you may have a very minor amount of deficit or surplus, but you're essentially, for all intents and purposes, within the margin of error of zero and thus balanced. The second question asks you, how is a debt different than a deficit? A 10-second answer: deficit is 1 year. So when you spend money in a calendar year, and again, those plans typically get released on a budget in the spring, usually around March or April, assuming normal circumstances, then you will have, if you have more spending than you have revenue, a deficit. Now, when your deficit doesn't get paid down, then it gets added to the accumulation of deficits over time. And the accumulation of deficits, the total amount that your government owes across all years, that's what we refer to as your national debt. So they are different terms. Deficit is 1 year, debt is the total amount. Otherwise, though, there's not really a lot to say on that. One thing I do want to note is that a government may have a surplus but debt. Okay, and that's definitely something that often will happen. In fact, it's very common. Almost every country in the entire modern world has a debt of some kind, but they may have good years where there's a surplus, and so they might devote a portion of the surplus to paying down the debt. But of course, they're not going to be able to just eliminate a debt in 1 year. It's fiscally impossible due to the scale and the size of the debt that most countries have. Third question: what is a structural deficit? Why is a structural deficit considered a sign of fiscal mismanagement in the application of fiscal policy? I like that question. I think it sort of blends with my own ideology, which you probably have guessed at this point. Structural deficit is considered to be, I'll be a little bit politically here, structural deficit is a sign of fiscal mismanagement. Essentially, when you have a structural deficit, what's happening is that you're in a booming period in your economy and you still have a deficit because you've committed so much in different kinds of expenditures, and sometimes the expenditure commitments carry over many years, that you end up having more spending than you have revenue, despite the fact that you may have record revenues available to you. Most economists who believe in sort of fiscal prudence would argue that a structural deficit is a sign that you just aren't controlling your spending in a long-term sensible way. It's different from a cyclical deficit. A cyclical deficit exists because of the fact that you have downturns, and downturns create unavoidable situations wherein you have lots of costs that you may not have anticipated and not a lot of revenue, which you also may not have been able to anticipate because of a downturn in the cycle. This calendar year, because of COVID-19, will uncertainly be declared a cyclical deficit. It was an unavoidable deficit year and probably a fairly deep one. We'll see how much blood is spilled, but I think it's pretty clear that this is going to be a really, really bad budgetary year, just given unforeseen circumstances. But if you wanted to sort of look back 2 or 3 years, we've had 2 or 3 years of near full employment and deficits. That is not a cyclical deficit. That would be a structural deficit because one could argue that there's no real reason to have had to have more spending than you had revenue, given the fact that the economy was in pretty good shape and there were no really long-term spending sort of commitments that the government was beholden to. It was simply a matter of the government had wanted to spend more money than it brought in. Were they massive deficits? No. Okay, and so that certainly would be something you could say in favor of the current level government, but they definitely would qualify as structural deficits, and certainly at least a little bit of a red flag from the perspective of properly applied Keynesian theory. Okay, that's it.